I've learned after 40 years of watching families rise and fall, that it's never the big things that crack a life wide open. It's the small things, the detail you almost overlook. In this story, it was a silver ring. A silver band with a heart-lock design that had been sitting quietly in a drawer for more than 2 decades. A daughter had seen it all her life on her mother's hand, never giving it much thought. But one winter night in a restaurant in Syracuse, New York, she saw the exact same ring on a stranger's finger. That was the start of it. A secret that had been buried under years of silence came to the surface, and nothing in that family's life would ever look the same again. The Olive Garden on Erie Boulevard was the kind of place where working families celebrated birthdays with breadsticks and where business deals happened over chicken parmesan. Sarah Chin had been waiting tables there for 8 years, long enough to recognize the regulars and spot the out-of-towners. On this particular Tuesday night in February, the snow was coming down hard outside, and the restaurant was quieter than usual. Sarah was wiping down table 12 when he walked in. Robert Davidson, 62 years old, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. His driver waited outside in a black Mercedes, engine running. Robert had driven up from Manhattan for a real estate deal. Something about converting old factories into luxury condos. Syracuse was cheap and cheap was profitable. Sarah's 8-year-old son Tommy was doing homework at the corner booth, like he did most nights when her mother Eleanor couldn't watch him. The boy looked up when Robert sat down at the adjacent table, his curiosity getting the better of his shyness. "Cool ring," Tommy said, pointing to the silver band on Robert's right hand. Robert glanced down at the ring, then at the boy. "This old thing? Had it since I was your age, actually." He slipped it off his finger and handed it to Tommy. "Careful with it, though. It's the only one like it." Sarah was taking Robert's order when she saw it. The ring in her son's small hands caught the restaurant's fluorescent light, and her pen froze mid-sentence. The heart-lock design, the worn silver surface, even the tiny inscription on the inside, she knew it all. She had seen it every day for 28 years on her mother's finger. "Where?" she started, then stopped herself. "Where did you get that ring?" Robert looked up from his menu, studying her face. "Family heirloom." "Why do you ask?" Sarah's hands were shaking now. She excused herself and walked quickly to the back, pulling out her phone to call her mother. "Mom, I need you to come to the restaurant now, and bring your ring." Eleanor Chin arrived 30 minutes later, her silver hair covered in snow, still wearing her factory uniform from the evening shift at Carrier Corporation. She had worked there for 15 years, ever since Sarah's father died. At 58, Eleanor carried herself like someone who had learned to expect disappointment but kept going anyway. She walked into the dining room and saw Robert Davidson sitting alone, turning his ring between his fingers. The years fell away from her face, 26 years to be exact. She was 32 again, working as a hotel housekeeper, falling in love with a guest who stayed for 2 weeks while his family's company negotiated a merger. Robert looked up and saw her. His face went white. "Allie. Bobby." Sarah watched from behind the counter as her mother sat down across from the man who had just become her past and her future in the same moment. Tommy, sensing something important was happening, quietly returned to his homework. "You have a daughter?" Robert said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded toward Sarah. "Her name is Sarah. She's 28. The math was simple enough. Robert closed his eyes and did the calculation twice, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Tell you what, Bobby? That the housekeeping girl you slept with for 2 weeks got pregnant? That she found out you were engaged to Catherine Morrison 3 days after you left town? That your family's company required you to marry within your social class to inherit your father's position? Robert's engagement to Catherine had been announced in the Albany Times-Union while Eleanor was throwing up in the hotel bathroom, trying to figure out how to tell a man she barely knew that she was carrying his child. The engagement photos showed a smiling couple at the country club, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged there. Eleanor had packed her things that night and moved to Syracuse, where no one knew her story. She worked double shifts at the Marriott downtown until Sarah was born, then took the job at Carrier because it offered health insurance. She never married. She never dated seriously. She raised Sarah alone and told her that her father was a man who couldn't stay. "I looked for you," Robert said quietly. "After Catherine and I separated, before we divorced, I went back to the hotel." "I know. They told me. But you didn't want to see me." Eleanor pulled off her glove and showed him her ring. The same heart-lock design, the same silver band. "I bought this one from a pawn shop in Albany. $15. I wanted to remember what it felt like to matter to someone, even if it was just pretend." Robert reached across the table and touched her hand. The ring was a cheap imitation, but the sentiment was real. "It wasn't pretend for me, Ellie. It was the most real thing in my life." Sarah had been listening from the kitchen doorway. She walked over to the table and sat down next to her mother. "So you're my father." "I didn't know," Robert said. "I swear to you I didn't know." Sarah studied his face. He had Tommy's nose and her own stubborn chin. "What happened to your wife?" "Catherine died 2 months ago. Cancer." "Children?" "2. They're both older than you. Jennifer is 35, Michael is 33. Sarah nodded slowly. Half-siblings she had never known existed. A stepmother who had died without ever knowing about her. A father who had lived 2 hours away for her entire life. "I want to know you," Robert said. "Both of you. I want to know my grandson." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Finally she looked at Sarah. "It's your decision, honey. I made mine 28 years ago. You can make yours now." Sarah's decision came in stages. First, she agreed to let Robert meet Tommy properly. Then she invited him to Tommy's basketball game at Henninger High School. Then she let him take Tommy to the Museum of Science and Technology downtown. She watched him carefully during those first few weeks. Robert Davidson was worth approximately $47 million, according to the Forbes list she found online. He owned 3 houses, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, and could buy the entire Olive Garden chain without blinking. But he sat on the bleachers at a middle school basketball game like any other grandfather, cheering when Tommy made a free throw. Sarah did her research. Robert's first marriage had been troubled for years before Catherine's diagnosis. They had separated twice, reconciled twice, and stayed together at the end only because of her illness. His children from that marriage, Jennifer and Michael, lived comfortable lives in Connecticut, managing trust funds and charity organizations. Eleanor was harder to convince. She worked her shifts at Carrier, came home to her small apartment on Onondaga Street, and tried to pretend that having Robert back in her life wasn't turning her entire world upside down. But Sarah caught her looking at herself differently in mirrors, buying new clothes for the first time in years. "He wants to take you to dinner," Sarah told her mother one evening. "Somewhere nice." "I'm 58 years old, Sarah. I work in a factory. What am I supposed to talk about with a millionaire?" "Same thing you talked about when you were 32 and he was 36. He's still the same person." Eleanor shook her head. "No, he's not. And neither am I." But she went to dinner anyway. Le Bernardin in Manhattan, a restaurant where meals cost more than Eleanor made in a week. Robert had sent a car to drive her down, and Sarah had helped her pick out a dress for Macy's clearance rack. They talked about Tommy's school performance, about Sarah's plans to go back to college, about Eleanor's job at the factory. Robert listened to stories about birthday parties in one-bedroom apartments and Christmas mornings with presents from the dollar store. Eleanor listened to stories about board meetings and charity galas and a life that had never quite felt like his own. "I missed everything," Robert said over dessert. "You missed some things. Not everything. I missed Sarah's first steps. Her first day of school. I missed watching you become a mother." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "You can't change the past, Bobby. But you can be here now." Jennifer Davidson Palmer and Michael Davidson learned about their father's Syracuse family on a Wednesday morning in March. They had driven up to confront him after their lawyer called with concerns about recent changes to Robert's will. They found him at Eleanor's apartment, teaching Tommy how to play chess on the kitchen table. The scene was domestic in a way that neither of his older children had ever experienced with their father. "Dad, we need to talk," Jennifer said. She was a thin woman with expensive highlights and the kind of confidence that came from never having to check her bank balance. Michael stood behind her, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. Robert looked up from the chessboard. "Jennifer." "Michael. This is Eleanor and this is Tommy." "We know who they are," Michael said. "The question is, what are they to you?" Robert moved his bishop and smiled at Tommy. "You're moved, buddy." "Dad, you can't be serious about this," Jennifer said. "You've known these people for 3 months. I've known Eleanor for 26 years. I just lost touch for a while." Jennifer sat down at the kitchen table, uninvited. "Look, I understand you're grieving. Mom just died, you're lonely, and these people are taking advantage. Stop right there." Robert's voice was quiet, but Tommy looked up from the chessboard, sensing danger. Eleanor stood up from where she had been folding laundry. "Maybe I should take Tommy for a walk." "No," Robert said. "Stay. They should meet their sister." Michael laughed. "Half-sister. If she's even that." Robert stood up slowly. At 62, he was still tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who commanded boardrooms. "Careful, son. We did the math, Dad. She was born 8 months after you were married to Mom. Are you sure she's even yours?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Tommy, go to your room and work on your homework." The boy disappeared down the hallway, but Sarah knew he was listening from around the corner. "Let me explain something to both of you," Robert said to Jennifer and Michael. "I loved your mother. I took care of her when she was sick and I mourned her when she died. But I was never happy in that marriage. We both knew it. The only reason we stayed together was because divorce would have complicated the business, and later because she was dying." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "That's not true." "It is true. And you know it. Your mother knew about Eleanor actually. She figured it out years ago when I kept going back to Syracuse for business trips that didn't need my personal attention. She never said anything because she understood that some parts of life aren't about money or social status." Michael was pacing now. "So what, you're going to marry this woman? Cut us out of the will? Leave everything to them?" Robert sat back down at the chessboard and moved Tommy's rook for him. "I'm going to live my life the way I should have lived it 26 years ago. Eleanor, Sarah, and Tommy are my family. You're also my family. There's room for everyone." "Not in the will, there isn't," Jennifer said. Robert looked at his older children for a long time. "The will has been updated. Sarah and Tommy will be provided for. You two will still inherit the majority of the estate, the houses, and the business interests. But you'll share it with your siblings as you should have been doing all along." Jennifer and Michael left that afternoon without saying goodbye to Eleanor or Sarah. But Sarah had seen something in Jennifer's eyes as she was leaving, not just anger but a kind of sadness that looked familiar. The sadness of someone who had never seen her father play chess on a kitchen table. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in May at the small Methodist church on James Street where Eleanor had taken Sarah as a child. Robert had offered to pay for something larger, more elaborate, but Eleanor had refused. "I want to get married where I prayed for you to come back," she told him. Sarah walked her mother down the aisle. Tommy served as ring bearer, carrying the original silver band that Robert had never stopped wearing. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress from Dillard's and carried daisies from the farmer's market. Robert's lawyer, William Preston, served as best man. Jennifer and Michael were not in attendance, but they had sent a card. Progress, Sarah thought. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, with food catered by the Olive Garden where Sarah still worked part-time while finishing her degree at Syracuse University. Robert had offered to pay for her education, and after months of pride-fueled resistance, she had accepted. "I have something for you," Robert told Eleanor during their first dance. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver ring, identical to the one he wore, identical to the cheap imitation Eleanor had bought 26 years earlier. But this one was real, platinum and diamonds with the heartlock design engraved by hand. "I had it made the day after I met Tommy. I wanted you to have the real thing." Eleanor looked down at her old ring, worn thin by years of factory work and washing dishes. "I don't know if I can give this one up." "Keep them both. One for the woman you were, one for the woman you are now." Sarah watched her parents dance and thought about all the birthdays her father had missed, all the school plays and soccer games and late-night fevers. But she also thought about Tommy, who would grow up knowing his grandfather's voice, knowing that he belonged to something larger than their small apartment on Onondaga Street. Later that evening, as the guests were leaving, Tommy ran up to Robert with something in his hand. "Hi, sir," he said formally, the way Sarah had taught him to address adults. "My grandma has a ring just like yours." He held up Eleanor's original ring, the $15 imitation she had refused to take off even after the ceremony. Robert knelt down to Tommy's level. "I know she does, buddy. Want to know a secret?" Tommy nodded. "That ring is more valuable than mine. Do you know why?" Tommy shook his head. "Because she wore it every day for 26 years thinking about someone she loved. That makes it priceless." Tommy thought about this for a moment, then nodded seriously and ran back to show the ring to his grandmother. Sarah walked over to Robert, who was watching Tommy with the expression of a man who had just discovered he had more to live for than he had ever imagined. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For coming back. For trying to be here now instead of just feeling sorry about the past." Robert put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I can't give you back the father you should have had when you were growing up. But I can try to be the father you need now." The snow had stopped falling outside, and through the church windows, Sarah could see the lights of Syracuse stretching out toward the horizon. Somewhere in Connecticut, her half-siblings were probably trying to understand how their family had suddenly gotten bigger and more complicated. Somewhere in the future, Tommy would tell his own children about the night his grandfather came back and changed everything. But right now, in this moment, Sarah Chin Davidson was watching her parents dance to music from a radio someone had plugged in behind the folding chairs, and she was thinking about how some stories end exactly where they're supposed to begin.